Good evening. If you can hear this voice, it means you're looking for quiet. Tonight, we travel far, across a land with no walls, where people lived by the wind and the horse. This is the story of a boy who grew to unite the steppe and build the largest empire the world has ever known. The story of Temujin, the man history remembers as Genghis Khan. But before we begin, if you enjoy Khan's stories told slowly, consider subscribing. Leave a comment below. What do you feel when you hear about these forgotten worlds? Your words are part of this journey too. Now, take a breath. Imagine the cold dawn of the Mongolian steppe. The smell of smoke, the whisper of grass, and a child opening his eyes to the sound of the wind. The steppe is not a place. It is an endless breath. A world without edges, without silence, and yet so full of it. Wind moves through the dry grass like a slow ocean. It whistles against bone, cloth, and skin, carrying with it the dust of everything that lived before. In the 12th century, this wind touched a small cluster of felt tents near the Onon River. The year is uncertain, -1162, perhaps, though numbers meant little there. Time was counted not in calendars, but in winter survived and foals born. Among those tents, wrapped in a blanket of animal hide, a child began to cry. His name was Temujin. He was born into the clan of the Borjigin, one among hundreds of tribes scattered across Mongolia's wide grasslands. His father, Yasuge, was a minor chieftain, a man of some authority, yet not powerful enough to shape the destiny that would one day bear his son's name. His mother, Holen, was a woman stolen from another tribe. Such was the custom of the steppe. Women, horses, and honor were often taken by force. Temujin's birth was not accompanied by omens, though later stories would invent them. They said he was born clutching a clot of blood in his hand, a sign of future greatness. But no one wrote that down when it happened. It was added later, when greatness needed a symbol. In truth, he was just another child born into the wind. A boy whose first lullaby was the whistle of cold through the tent seams. Life on the steppe was never gentle. Food was dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and whatever the hunt allowed. Families moved with the seasons, following the grass. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. There was little room for fear, but much for endurance. Yasuge, Temujin's father, belonged to the Kamag Mongol Confederation, a fragile network of tribes that spent as much time fighting one another as they did trading. He dreamed of uniting them under his leadership. But dreams were brittle things on the steppe. When Temujin was about 9, his father arranged a betrothal. It was practical, as all alliances were. The girl's name was Bert. She lived with the Ondrot tribe. Temujin would stay there for a time, learning their customs. His father left him there and turned back toward home. He never made it. Yasuge was poisoned by members of a rival clan, the Tatars, who recognized him at a feast and served him a treacherous drink. He rode home, sick and fading, and died soon after. With his death, protection vanished. A chieftain's power ended with his breath. Rivals descended quickly. The family, Holen and her 7 children, were abandoned by their own tribe, left to starve on the river bank. They survived on roots, berries, and the scraps of old alliances. Temujin learned hunger before he learned war. He learned what it meant to be nothing, a name without a banner. The winters were long. Snow drifted over the plains, hiding the bodies of horses that had frozen standing. Holen kept her family alive with the stubborn will of someone who had already been stolen once and would not be taken again. Temujin trapped fish through holes in the ice, stripped bark for broth, and scavenged bones for marrow. From that hunger grew something iron. He watched how wolves moved in packs, how they never fought among themselves when the cold was cruelest. He wondered why men could not do the same. Among the brothers, tension grew. One, named Begta, began to act as the head of the family, taking food and decisions for himself. One evening, when tempers cracked under hunger, Temujin and his younger brother Khazar killed him. It was the first life Temujin took. He was perhaps 12. His mother's grief was terrible. She struck him and cursed the act, calling it shameful, but it also marked him. He had crossed the line between endurance and control. Years later, he would speak little of it, but those who knew him said he never forgot the feeling of the bowstring on his fingers. When the thaw came, the steppe turned green again, pretending to forgive the winter. Temujin hunted marmots, tended goats, and watched the distant riders of other clans. Every cloud of dust on the horizon could mean trade or death. Life was a constant balance between hospitality and suspicion. In time, he sought allies. He found one in Jamuka, a boy from another noble line. They swore brotherhood according to steppe custom, exchanging gifts and words of eternal loyalty. Such vows were sacred, but not always permanent. When Temujin reached his late teens, he returned to the Ondjarot to claim Bert, his promised wife. She was waiting. Their marriage was a small ceremony. No priests, only fire, milk, and silence. Her dowry included a black sable coat, a gift that would soon shape his fate. Shortly after the wedding, disaster came again. A rival tribe, the Merkits, raided their camp and captured Bert. For Temujin, this was not only personal but political, a wound to his honor, a threat to his name. He escaped, gathered allies, and appealed to a powerful Khan, Togrul of the Karaite tribe. The sable coat was offered to Togrul as a token of loyalty. The older Khan accepted, calling Temujin his adopted son. Together, with Togrul and Jamuka, Temujin rode north to rescue Bert. They found the Merkits, attacked their camp by night, and freed her. The raid was swift and brutal, though the records keep few details. Afterward, Bert returned to him, pregnant. Whether the child, Joki, was Temujin's or a Merkit's, no one could say. Temujin raised him as his own. It would matter later. From these events, the young leader's reputation began to form. Not as a conqueror yet, but as a man who could organize chaos. He rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. He remembered every favor and every wound. In the years that followed, he gathered followers from scattered families and broken clans, people tired of the endless blood feuds. He offered them something rare on the steppe: order. He reorganized the tribes into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. He appointed leaders by merit, not lineage. It was radical, almost heretical, but it worked. When men followed Temujin, they were no longer servants of one clan. They were soldiers of a cause that did not yet have a name. Still, there were enemies. Jamuka, his old blood brother, began to see him not as an ally but a rival. In the year 1187, their friendship broke. Two camps of the Mongols fought one another, a civil war on an endless field. Temujin lost the first battle and fled. For a while, he disappeared into the folds of the land, hunted, hungry again. But he had learned from every defeat. He waited, he rebuilt. He studied how to turn loyalty into discipline. The steppe, meanwhile, remained the same, windswept, vast, and indifferent. Tribes rose and vanished like the seasons. The Tanguts to the south traded silk for horses. The Jin dynasty to the east taxed merchants and built walls. The steppe ignored them all. Temujin began to move again, gathering strength. His followers called him Khan, a title still small, still local, yet it meant that others had begun to see something in him beyond mere survival. By the dawn of the 13th century, the balance had changed. Temujin had unified most of the eastern tribes under his banner. His laws, known later as the Yasa, emphasized discipline, loyalty, and justice. Theft was punished harshly. Women were protected under his decree, a rarity among nomads, and in his army, a slave could rise by merit as high as a noble. It was not mercy, it was efficiency, but it made men follow him without question. In 1206, after decades of struggle, the tribal leaders gathered near the Onon River. They held a great Kurultai, a council. There, They raised him on a white felt carpet, a symbol of elevation. They proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The boy born to hunger and exile had become the master of the steppe. No one at that council could have imagined what would come next. That within a single generation, their horses would drink from rivers in China, Persia, and Europe alike. That caravans would cross safely under his laws. That cities would fall silent before the dust of his armies. But that was still far away. For now, the campfires flickered in the wind, men sang low songs. The night stretched endlessly, full of stars sharp as blades. And in the quiet between gusts of wind, one could almost hear the breath of a child who had once slept hungry under this same sky. By the time Temujin reached his 30s, the Mongolian steppe had already learned his name. Not yet with fear. That would come later, but with a kind of uneasy curiosity. He was a man who survived exile, betrayal, and loss, yet rose each time with more followers than before. People began to say he had the favor of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, though Temujin himself rarely spoke of faith. He spoke of loyalty, of rules, and of the kind of order that had never existed in the steppe. The world he sought to change was fragmented. Tribes fought endlessly, for horses, for women, for grazing land. One insult could spark a war that lasted generations. A man might wake one morning a free herdsman and fall asleep a captive in another camp. Temujin understood this chaos because he had lived inside it. He knew the weakness it created, and how easy it was for outsiders, like the Jin dynasty or the Khitan remnants, to manipulate it. So he began to rebuild the Mongols not as a collection of bloodlines, but as a system. He divided his people into units, tens, hundreds, thousands, each with a leader responsible not for his own family, but for everyone under him. It broke the ancient tribal pattern, replacing loyalty to kin with loyalty to command. A revolutionary idea in a land where ancestry had been law. Discipline replaced tradition. A man who disobeyed could be executed, even if he was of noble birth. A poor soldier who showed courage could be promoted, even above his superiors. Among nomads, this was unheard of, yet it worked. The warriors trained in silence, moving like one body. They could ride 4 days without fire, sleeping in shifts, eating dried meat and fermented milk. Each carried a bow of layered horn and sinew, small but powerful enough to pierce armor at 200 meters. They rode small horses, fast, tireless, able to survive on frozen grass. Every man had several mounts, switching them in rhythm so none would tire. It was an army of motion, born from the habits of herders. But Temujin knew that power required more than soldiers. He needed law, and so he created one. The Yasa, a code both oral and sacred, was the foundation of his new world. It forbade theft, adultery, and betrayal. It required absolute obedience to a leader and demanded fairness in distribution of loot. Even the Khan himself was bound by it. To enforce this order, he established messengers, scouts, and record keepers. They carried orders across the plains at astonishing speed, each rider changing horses at relay stations spaced a day apart. This system, the Yam, became the veins of his empire. He also redefined how the Mongols treated faith. Shamans, Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, and Muslims all existed within his domain. Temujin tolerated them all. He believed that every god was an aspect of the same eternal sky. As long as prayers did not divide his people, they could be offered freely. It was a strange kind of enlightenment, born not of philosophy, but of necessity. Still, not everyone welcomed his order. Many tribal lords feared it. They preferred the old ways, where power was personal and revenge was private. The first to rebel was Jamuka, Temujin's childhood friend, blood brother, and now rival. Jamuka accused him of destroying tradition, of turning free men into servants. He gathered tribes loyal to the old customs and challenged Temujin in battle. The steppe shook with hooves. Two vast camps faced one another near the Onan River. The fight was fierce, brutal, almost ritualistic. When it ended, Temujin's army stood victorious. Jamukha was captured and, at his own request, executed without bloodshed, his spine broken. A mercy in Mongol custom, Temujin did not celebrate. He looked over the field of bodies and said only, "The steppe will never be won until we stop calling each other enemies." After Jamukha's death, resistance crumbled. Tribe by tribe, the Mongol lands bent toward unity. Some surrendered willingly, others were destroyed. Temujin's followers saw his victories as destiny made visible, the will of the blue sky. In 1206, the leaders of all major clans gathered near the source of the Onan River for a Kurultai, a great council. They sat in a vast circle of tents. Before them stood Temujin, dressed in simple leather, his hair bound with silver rings. He had no crown, no jewels, only the calm of a man who had already walked through every hardship imaginable. They lifted him onto a white felt carpet, a symbol of elevation and purity, and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It was not just a title. It was a declaration that the Mongols were no longer a scattered people. They were a nation, one law, one army, one destiny. Under his rule, the steppe changed. For the first time in living memory, travelers could cross from one horizon to another without fear of ambush. Caravans moved safely between forests, rivers, and deserts. Disputes were settled by council, not blood. Even theft of a horse, the gravest of crimes, became rare. Temujin moved his capital from camp to camp, following the rhythm of grass and herds. His tent was large but plain, felt and wood, no throne of gold. He preferred to eat with his generals, sharing the same food, dried mutton, milk tea, and fermented mare's milk. He spoke little, asked much, listened more. Those who served him said that when he was silent, the camp seemed to grow quieter, as if even the wind waited for his thoughts. At night, he would often stand alone outside his tent, looking at the stars. The Mongols believed each soul became a star when it died. Perhaps he was counting them, the friends lost, the enemies forgotten, the countless names swallowed by time. He was still a man of the steppe, after all, shaped by hunger, wind, and memory. By uniting the tribes, Genghis Khan did what no one before him had done. He turned chaos into order without walls, without cities, without writing. His empire, at that moment, existed only in minds and oaths, yet it was stronger than any kingdom made of stone. The next chapters of his life would stretch far beyond these plains, to China, to Persia, to the edges of the known world. But those are stories for another night. For now, the steppe lies quiet, the horses sleep standing. The grass bends under the same wind that once carried a boy's name across the empty land. Temujin's, the child of the steppe, the man who became the world's horizon. When the tribes were finally united, the steppe fell into a strange silence. For the first time in memory, the wind carried no war cries, only the creak of saddles and the soft breathing of horses. The men who had once raided one another now trained side by side. Their bows were the same, their tents alike, their loyalty bound to one name, Genghis Khan. Yet peace for its own sake was never his goal. He saw unity not as an end, but as a weapon, a sharpened edge pointed outward. The world beyond the grasslands was large, rich, and divided. To the south stood the Jin dynasty, masters of northern China, powerful and complacent behind their walls. To the west lay the Tangic kingdom of Shizia, smaller but proud, its oases glimmering at the edge of the desert. Beyond them stretched the cities of Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khwarazm, trading jewels of the Silk Road, each guarded by its own ruler, each certain of its importance. The Mongols were barely a rumor to them then, but that rumor was moving. Genghis Khan began his campaigns with the Tanguts. He moved not with haste, but with a patience that unnerved his enemies. His armies did not march in columns. They spread like mist, traveling separately, meeting only at chosen points. Scouts rode days ahead, mapping rivers, counting wells, marking where grass still grew. When the Tanguts refused to acknowledge his rule, he descended upon them with speed no one thought possible. Town after town fell. Their walls meant nothing against arrows that rained from every direction. When the Tangut ruler surrendered, Genghis Khan accepted his tribute, then withdrew, leaving behind silence and ash. The message was clear. Submission brought safety. Defiance erased names. But the true test came with the Jin. For centuries, the Jin dynasty had dominated northern China, demanding tribute from the steppe tribes. They considered the nomads inferior, useful as soldiers, expendable as neighbors. Genghis Khan remembered those years of humiliation. In 1211, he crossed the Gobi Desert with perhaps 100,000 riders. The heat killed horses, the cold at night froze their water skins. But they pressed on, guided by the stars and the instinct of men who had never feared distance. They struck at the Great Wall not as one army, but as many streams converging at once. Towers fell, garrisons scattered. The Mongols bypassed fortresses they could not take, cutting supply lines, burning granaries, waiting until hunger opened the gates. The Jin generals, raised in comfort, could not match such movement. They waited for battles that never arrived, while the steppes swallowed their outposts one by one. In 1215, the Mongols captured Zhongdu, modern Beijing. Fire consumed the city 4 days. Genghis Khan watched from a hill as smoke curled into the sky. He did not smile. Victory, to him, was simply proof that his system worked. When the Jin emperor fled south, the north belonged to the Haussmann. The Mongols had broken the richest empire in the east. After the fall of Zhongdu, the Khan turned west. The Silk Road called to him, a chain of wealth, spices, and arrogance stretching toward lands no Mongol had seen. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, controlled those cities. At first, there was peace. The Khan sent caravans to trade, gifts of gold and silk, letters sealed with his mark. But the Shah's governor at Otrar accused the merchants of spying and had them killed. It was a mistake that changed history. When Genghis Khan heard the news, he did not rage. He sat silent for a long time, then said only that the earth itself would forget Otrar. In 1219, his armies rode west across the desert. They split into multiple forces, converging on the cities of Transoxiana like falling stars. Bukhara fell first. Chroniclers later wrote that the Khan entered the mosque, climbed to the pulpit, and said, "If you desire to know what heaven decrees, look upon me." It was not boastful, only factual. His arrival was the decree. Samarkand resisted longer, its defenders confident in their walls. But the Mongols built siege engines on the spot, using local craftsmen spared from other towns. They hurled stones, fire, and fear. When the gates opened, there was no mercy. Soldiers, scholars, and traders alike were swept into the same wind of death. The Shah fled into the mountains and died there, hunted even in exile. His empire, vast and proud, vanished within a single year. The campaigns that followed were not chaos, they were organized destruction. Each army had orders, scouts, maps, and signals carried by burning arrows. No move was left to chance. The Mongols learned to build bridges, to swim horses across rivers, to carry siege towers on carts. Their empire was becoming not just mobile, but technical. From conquered engineers, they learned how to cast siege bells, how to use flaming oil. They adapted everything and forgot nothing. Genghis Khan himself rode with the front ranks. He wore no armor of gold, only iron and leather. His tent at night was the same as any commander's. He ate what his soldiers ate. When wounded by an arrow, he refused to stop the campaign. To his men, he seemed unbreakable. To his enemies, he seemed inevitable. By the mid-1220s, his empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. No single road could hold the measure of it. Messengers carried orders from China to Persia in weeks. The Yam relay system expanded. each station stocked with horses, food, and guards. Communication became his greatest weapon. Even far apart, his armies moved like a single body, responding to one pulse. But conquest was never without weight. Whole cities disappeared, rivers ran red for days. Chroniclers counted the dead, but numbers blurred into myth. The Khan did not kill for pleasure, he killed for control. He believed terror was faster than negotiation, and he was right. Resistance collapsed before his name reached the gates, yet among the ruins, trade returned. Caravans traveled under his protection, thieves vanished. The Silk Road became safer than it had been in centuries. Scholars crossed from Baghdad to Karakoram. Letters in Persian, Chinese, and Arabic arrived in the same court. It was the beginning of something strange, an empire of both destruction and order, terror and law. When his armies paused, he returned to the steppe. There he sat among the grass, older, quieter. The wind that had once carried his childhood songs now carried the smoke of 100 cities. He watched his sons argue, his generals expand their ambitions. He knew the pattern. Even the greatest unities cracked with time. He had bound men by discipline, not blood. Someday, that bond would weaken. But for the moment, the world was one horizon, his. In 1227, during a campaign against the Tanguts who had once surrendered and rebelled again, Genghis Khan fell ill. Some say he was injured, others, that the years finally caught him. He died before the final surrender. His body returned secretly to Mongolia. The place of his burial was never marked, as he had wished. The earth itself became his tomb. And so the wind returned to what it had always done, moving over grass, erasing tracks. Yet beneath it, the world was no longer the same. The empire he built would outlive him, carried forward by his sons and grandsons, reaching farther west, deeper south, until the edges of maps bent to its touch. For now, though, imagine the silence after the last hoofbeats fade. The steppe is calm again, the tents are dark, somewhere under the eternal sky. A mound of earth hides the man who once united a world that had never believed it could be united. And the wind, as always, remembers everything, but tells no one. The steppe was quiet for the first time in generations. The tribes had stopped fighting, the banners of rival families lowered. Smoke from the camps rose straight into the sky instead of being scattered by the wind of war. Temujin, now called Genghis Khan, stood at the center of a land finally united. For centuries the Mongols had been hunters, raiders, wanderers, strong but divided. Now they were one, and unity demanded motion. The steppe could not stay still for long. Peace, to the Mongols, was only the brief rest between rides. When the Khan looked south, he saw the Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China. Their cities were immense, their walls thick, their silk bright enough to catch the light of the sun miles away. They had wealth, grain, and arrogance. For generations, the Jin had taken tribute from the tribes. They called the nomads barbarians, useful only as soldiers or slaves. Genghis Khan remembered those years of humiliation. Now he had an army unlike any the world had seen. Organized, disciplined, silent when it needed to be, furious when commanded. He decided the time had come to turn the bow outward. Before riding against the Jin, he struck first at the Tanguts, a smaller kingdom to the southwest. Their capital sat among mountains and oases, a mirage of gardens and stone. The Tanguts refused his request for submission. He replied with movement. His riders crossed deserts where other armies would have died of thirst. Scouts rode ahead, counting wells, marking where grass still grew. When his army appeared before the Tangut walls, it was not as a line, but as a storm. The cities fell one after another. Their king surrendered, offering tribute and his daughter. The Khan accepted both, then withdrew. The message was simple. Those who submitted lived. Those who resisted vanished. But his eyes were already on the Jin. In 1211, he gathered his generals, Subutai, Jeeb, Jelm, Kublai's father Tolui, and led the Mongols south across the Gobi Desert. The heat broke horses, the nights froze water skins. Still they rode, their discipline held. Each man carried dried meat, a few arrows, and the certainty that he would not question orders. They reached the Great Wall and found it empty. The Jin garrisons had fled. The wall, so feared by others, meant nothing to them. The Mongols flowed around it like water. They avoided battles they did not need, striking where food and fear were richest. Fortresses that resisted too long were starved until the gates opened from within. Villages surrendered without a fight, bringing food, animals, and guides. In 1213, the Jin emperor sent envoys offering peace, but Genghis Khan refused. He said that one cannot negotiate with a sword still drawn. The following year, his armies swept through northern China like wind through reeds. Cities burned 4 days. Chroniclers later wrote that the smoke darkened the sun. By 1215, Zhongdu, today's Beijing, fell. The Khan watched the fires from a hill, saying nothing. Victory did not excite him. It confirmed that his order worked. When the Jin emperor fled south, the north belonged to the steppe. Conquest changed the Mongols as much as it changed the conquered. They learned siege warfare from Chinese engineers. They built catapults, scaling towers, even early forms of gunpowder bombs. The Khan valued skill above all. Captured artisans were spared and sent to teach. Soldiers who refused to yield were erased. Those who obeyed were absorbed. In his camp, languages mixed, Turkic, Chinese, Persian, carried by the wind. What had begun as one man's revenge was becoming a machine of expansion. After China, he turned west. Along the Silk Road lay the Khwarezmian Empire, rich and proud, its cities glittering with gold domes and tiled masks. At first, he offered friendship. He sent a caravan of merchants, gifts of silk, letters of goodwill. The Shah of Khwarezm, suspicious, accused them of spying and had them executed. One messenger escaped and carried the news back across the desert. The Khan listened in silence. Then he said, "They have chosen war." In 1219, the Mongols came. They moved not as one army, but as many, swift, silent, deliberate. Bukhara fell first, Samak and soon after. Chroniclers wrote that the Khan entered Bukhara's mosque, climbed the pulpit, and said, "If you wish to know what heaven decrees, look upon me." It was not arrogance. It was a statement of order, that the world was moving as it must. The Shah fled, leaving his cities behind. One after another, they fell. Some surrendered and were spared. Others resisted and disappeared. The Mongols were methodical. They used fear as strategy, letting stories of destruction travel faster than their horses. Armies surrendered before the first arrow flew. But within their ranks, rules remained strict. Loot was divided evenly. Women and children were spared, unless the city rebelled again. To the Khan, discipline was civilization. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was gone. Its cities were dust, its rivers filled with the wreckage of walls. The Mongols reached the Caspian Sea, a horizon of water they had never seen. Scouts rode to its shores and filled leather bags with salt to carry home, proof that the world continued beyond imagination. The Khan sent 2 of his greatest generals, Subutai and Jeeb, farther west, to explore the unknown. They rode across the Caucasus, into Georgia, and then the plains of the Rus. They won every battle, studied every road, and returned with maps, names, and silence. The Mongols were learning the shape of the world they would soon conquer. Through all of it, Genghis Khan remained the same, practical, watchful, and patient. He wore simple armor, ate the same food as his soldiers, drank water when others drank wine. He listened more than he spoke to his men. He was not a legend, but a certainty, the still center of a moving empire. When wounded by an arrow during battle, he refused to stop. The army marched on. Later, he told his generals that pain was only another kind of messenger. By the mid-1220s, his empire had doubled. The Silk Road, once dangerous and broken, now flowed with caravans again. Merchants paid taxes, but traveled safely. Messages moved from China to Persia in weeks. The yam, the postal system of relay stations, expanded across thousands of kilometers. Each station kept fresh horses, food, and guards. The Mongols could communicate across half the earth faster than any empire before them. Order and terror had become the same language. But conquest had its course. Entire peoples vanished, forests burned. Cities that resisted became ashes. Chroniclers counted the dead in the hundreds of thousands. But the truth was beyond numbers. The Khan's purpose was not cruelty. It was structure. He believed the world needed one rule, one law, one peace. And that peace could only come through total control. In 1226, he turned once more against the Tanguts, who had rebelled despite their earlier surrender. Age and exhaustion were beginning to show, but he refused to rest. He led his army across frozen rivers, his breath white in the night air. He saw the last Tangut city burn before his health failed. In 1227, he died, some say from injury, others from illness. His body was carried secretly back to Mongolia, its resting place unknown. When he died, the horses did not stop moving, the empire did not pause. His generals sealed his death in silence until the campaign was finished. Even in death, he commanded obedience. The steppe, at last, was quiet again, but it was no longer only the steppe. It was the center of the world. After the fall of the Jin and the Khwarezmian empires, the world began to widen for the Mongols. The horizon no longer ended at the edge of the steppe. It stretched into forests, deserts, and stone cities whose names few Mongols could pronounce. The empire had become a moving map. Wherever a horse could stand, a banner could rise, and still the riders went on. Subutai, the quiet strategist, was already planning the next horizon. He had followed Genghis Khan across Asia, and now led armies under the great Khan Gedai. His eyes were on the west, the lands beyond the Caspian Sea, beyond the mountains, beyond everything the Mongols yet understood. He rode with Beta, the son of Joki, commanding a host of perhaps 150,000 men. They called it the Great Western Campaign. They began with the Volga Bulgars. The rivers froze early that winter, turning the water into glass. The Mongols used the ice as a road, crossing where ships would have sailed. They struck swiftly, destroying towns and forts before spring thawed the rivers. Then they moved into the Rus principalities, loose alliances of cities that traded furs and silver, but rarely cooperated with each other. The Mongols exploited the disunity, as they always did. One city was spared, while its neighbor burned. Hesitation became strategy. In 1237, they attacked Ryazan. Chroniclers wrote that the sky glowed red 4 days. Vladimir followed, then Suzdal, then the grand city of Kiev. Its golden domes collapsed under fire and stone. The survivors described the invaders not as men, but as a moving storm, silent until the very moment of impact. Monasteries burned, and bells melted in the snow. The Rus princes fled north, carrying relics and disbelief. Yet even in destruction, the Mongols were systematic. They counted the population, established tributes, appointed local governors. They did not stay, but they never left entirely. The Golden Horde was forming, a new dominion that would rule the plains of Russia for 2 centuries. From there, the campaign split like a river. One branch moved south into the Caucasus, crossing mountain passes higher than clouds. They fought the Georgians, Armenians, and Alans, driving them before winter storms. Another branch turned west through the steppe of modern Ukraine, approaching the borders of Europe. There the air grew thicker, the forests denser, and the names harder to remember. Subutai recorded them anyway, marking each town on his map of memory. To him, conquest was geometry, lines, circles, distances. In 1241, they entered Poland. Scouts rode far ahead, unseen, but always listening. At Legnica, the Mongols faced a coalition of knights under Duke Henry the Pious. The battle was short. Heavy armor slowed the Europeans. The Mongols pretended to retreat, drawing the knights into an ambush. Arrows fell like rain. When the dust cleared, the Polish army was gone. Days later, at the Sojo River in Hungary, the same pattern repeated. The Hungarian king's army, one of the largest in Europe, was annihilated overnight. Chroniclers wrote of thunder and fire, but it was only discipline and smoke. The Mongols moved as if one mind guided thousands of hands. Villages emptied before them. Peasants fled into forests. Priests prayed for angels, but no angels came. What came instead was a message. Resistance was pointless, tribute inevitable. The Mongols demanded obedience, not conversion. They had no interest in souls, only in order. And once tribute was established, they moved on. By the summer of 1242, they had reached the edges of Austria and the Adriatic Sea. The next step would have been the heart of Europe, Vienna, Venice, Rome perhaps. But then, news arrived from the east. The great Conquest was dead. According to custom, every prince had to return to Mongolia to elect his successor. The army turned around. No discussion, no hesitation. In the Mongol mind, unity was greater than victory. They disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind silence and ash. Europe never forgot that silence. For centuries, the word Tartar would mean fear. But for the Mongols, it was simply another march completed. They had tested the edge of the world and learned that it could be crossed. Their maps now reached the forests of Poland, the Danube, the edges of the Mediterranean. The earth had grown smaller. Back in the east, the empire continued to pulse. Caravans carried silk and spices across the same routes that armies had taken. Trade followed destruction like grass after rain. The Mongols taxed merchants, but guaranteed their safety. Under their seal, a caravan could travel from the Chinese plains to the Black Sea unharmed. The same men who had burned cities were now protecting markets. To them, it was not contradiction. It was balance. Order required both fear and reward. At Karakorum, the new capital, envoys arrived from every corner of the known world. Persian scholars, Russian princes, Tibetan monks, European friars, all came to see the center of this impossible empire. They found no marble palaces, no golden thrones, only tents, wood, and dust, and in the middle, the descendants of a man who once lived by trapping fish through ice. Yet from that plane, orders still radiated outward. The world moved to the rhythm of hearses changing at relay stations, of messages written in dozens of languages, but sealed with one emblem. The Mongols were not done. To the south, the Song dynasty still ruled China. To the west, Persia and Mesopotamia awaited. But for a moment, brief and weightless, the empire rested. The conquests had reached the farthest lands of the setting sun. Men who had ridden from the Onon River now stood beside the Danube. The distance between them and home was measured not in miles, but in stories. The world they had crossed was no longer divided. It was a single horizon. Night fell over the camp. Fires flickered, horses snorted softly. The generals drank fermented milk and spoke of new campaigns, new maps. Above them, the sky stretched unbroken, the same blue dome that had watched their fathers. Somewhere far to the east, the wind that once carried Genghis Khan's voice still moved through the grass. The empire was vast, alive, and waiting. Its riders slept with saddles for pillows, dreaming not of peace, but of distance. Tomorrow, they would ride again. The Mongol Empire had reached farther than any before it, but still it moved. The west had been tested and found breakable. Now the east waited. The lands beyond the Yangtze River, the valleys of the Song dynasty, were still rich, still unconquered. Between the forests of China and the deserts of Persia, the riders of the steppe turned once more toward sunrise. Conquest had become a rhythm: ride, strike, rebuild, move. The empire breathed like a living thing, inhaling nations, exhaling laws. When Genghis took the title of Great Khan, he inherited not only his father's empire, but his restlessness. He ruled from Karakoram, a city of tents, wooden halls, and open space. Around it, the plains rippled with smoke from countless hearths. Messengers arrived daily from every direction, from Hungary, from Korea, from the edge of India, each carrying tablets of birch bark engraved with orders and reports. The Yam relay system kept the empire stitched together. Every 30 kilometers a new horse waited, a new rider stood ready. Information traveled faster than any kingdom could imagine. The empire was not ruled by distance, but by momentum. Gedai continued the war against the remaining Jin strongholds. The campaign took years, not for a lack of strength, but for the patience of strategy. Cities that resisted were starved rather than stormed. The Mongols preferred certainty to spectacle. By 1234, the last Jin emperor was dead, his dynasty erased like a line brushed from sand. The north of China now belonged entirely to the Mongols. From the steppes of Manchuria to the Yellow River, one law ruled. But the Song dynasty still stood in the south, richer, more advanced, more populous than anything the Mongols had faced. It was a different world: rice fields, canals, gunpowder weapons, stone fortresses. The Song built walls that stretched 4 miles, towers that could fire bolts farther than any bow. To the Mongols, it was another kind of landscape, not grass and wind, but rivers and walls. They adapted. They always adapted. In 1235, Gedai ordered his son, Gyaik, and his brother Terlui to lead a new campaign south. Chinese engineers served alongside Mongol generals. Siege machines were built on site, using local wood and forced labor. The army moved slowly, like a tide creeping inland. For each fortress captured, the conscribes recorded its population, its resources, its taxes. Conquest had become administration. Meanwhile, far to the west, other armies continued their advance. Beta and Subatari ruled the lands of the Rus through tribute. From their camps on the Volga, they watched the rivers freeze each winter, waiting for caravans from Karakoram. In Persia, Comacon led a new invasion into the remains of the Khwarezmian state. The cities of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia fell one by one. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, began to tremble at rumors of hoofbeats. The Mongols did not yet ride there. That would come under Hulagu years later, but the shadow had already reached the Tigris. The empire now stretched from the edges of Europe to the South China Sea. Trade routes reopened under Mongol patrols. Caravans carried Silk-West, Silver-East, and stories in both directions. For the first time in memory, the heart of Asia was safe to cross. Merchants paid taxes gladly, for the roads were guarded. The Yam stations, spaced like beads along a thread, provided shelter, food, and new horses. Messengers could travel thousands of kilometers in days. To the rest of the world, it seemed magic. To the Mongols, it was discipline, but expansion carried weight. The army was still nomadic. It had no roots, no pause. The more land they took, the more they had to manage. Translators, tax collectors, engineers, scribes, the empire was becoming a network of professions as much as warriors. Genghis Khan had built a world of riders. Gedai was building a world of administrators. His rule was not only over people, but over movement itself. The Song campaign dragged on 4 years. The Mongols struggled against heat, disease, and rivers that split their forces. Southern China was different. Thick forests, endless rain, walls that could not burn. But the Khan's patience never faltered. Each year, new armies arrived, each city fell, each river crossed. The Mongols built floating bridges, ferried horses on rafts, and used gunpowder against the Song's own defenses. Slowly, the south began to bend. Back in Karakoram, envoys from every part of the world came to bow before the Khan. Persians brought silver, Koreans offered jade, Russians sent falcons. European friars arrived with letters from kings who had never seen the steppe. They found a court both simple and immense. No gold throne, no marble halls, only a wooden dais and a man surrounded by maps. The air smelled of milk, leather, and ink. Translators whispered in a dozen languages at once. The great Khan spoke through silence. By the late 1230s, the empire was at its height. The borders were fluid, but the reach was total. In Persia, Mongol governors collected taxes in Persian script. In China, scholars copied laws in Chinese. In the steppes, soldiers still trained with bows and drank fermented mare's milk under the stars. It was an empire of contrasts, a machine made of wine and ink, fire and parchment. Then, in 1241, news came from the west. Gedai was dead. The empire paused again. The Mongol princes returned to Karakoram for the Kurultai, the council that would choose his successor. Gyayak, his son, became Great Khan after long debate. His reign was short, but during it the machinery of empire never stopped. Armies still moved, caravans still crossed. The laws still held. The years that followed were both continuation and exhaustion. The empire had expanded to the limits of endurance. It now ruled more people than any power before it. Communications still worked, but slowly. The further messages traveled, the longer they took to return. The unity that had once felt natural began to strain, yet for now, it held. The memory of Genghis Khan's will, his belief in order through motion, still guided them. The last campaigns of this generation reached into Korea and northern Vietnam. The Mongols crossed mountains, rivers, and monsoons, fighting diseases they could not name. They won most battles, but lost countless men to the landscape itself. In the west, their scouts stood on the edges of the Middle East. The horizon had no more directions to offer. Everywhere they looked, there was already a Mongol banner. And so the empire began to slow, not by decision, but by distance. The empire that had begun with hooves and hunger was now a system of paper, law, and dust. The riders still moved, but the wars had slowed. Across Asia, the sound of conquest had become the sound of carts, messengers, and merchants. For the first time in centuries, there was a strange kind of peace. The Mongols called it nothing at all. Later ages would call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. After the death of Gedai, the world of the Mongols hesitated, then settled into rhythm. His widow, Tregine Khoton, ruled as regent until a new Great Khan was chosen. Her power came not from blood alone, but from the loyalty of generals and governors who had learned that stability was worth protecting. She continued the system her husband had refined, one that could make decisions faster than empires made of stone. Orders still crossed half the earth in weeks. The roads were alive. In Karakoram, the first true capital of the Mongols, life gathered where once there had been only tents. It was a small city, by later standards, a patchwork of wood and felt, but to the steppe it was a miracle, a city that breathed like a camp and ruled like a court. Here, languages met: Persian, Chinese, Turkic, Arabic, Russian. Each brought its own script, its own style of speech. Translators became the most valuable people in the empire. No word could cross the world without them. Karakoram was practical. The streets were simple, the palace modest, but its workshops were filled with artisans, brought from every conquered land. Persian metal workers cast silver bowls. Chinese craftsmen built fountains that spilled wine instead of water. From Central Asia came weavers, from Europe carpenters, from India jewelers. It was a museum of the living world, a collection of skills gathered under one sky. Yet the capital was only a symbol. The empire itself was the road. The Yam relay, the system of postal stations that Genghis Khan had imagined, now stretched from the edge of Korea to the shores of the Caspian. Every 30 or 40 kilometers stood a station stocked with food, fodder, and fresh horses. Riders changed mounts without stopping, their saddlebags full of scrolls sealed in leather. They carried everything: decrees, taxes, news, even private letters between families separated by deserts. At night, the stations glowed with oil lamps. From above, the empire must have looked like a string of flickering lights cutting through darkness. These roads were the empire's bloodstream. They allowed the Great Khan to know what happened at the farthest edge of his rule before most kings learned what happened in their own cities. They carried more than words, they carried order. Governors were appointed, taxes collected, supplies delivered. The Mongols had turned movement into government. Geday's successor, Genghis Khan, continued the administration, though his reign was short. After him came Mongol, son of Tolui, who would give shape to the empire's maturity. He introduced censuses across all conquered lands, Persia, China, Russia. Every person, animal, and field was counted. For nomads, it was a strange idea that the measure of the world could fit on a list, but it worked. The Mongols could now predict grain harvests, troop numbers, and taxes with accuracy. It was bureaucracy born from saddle discipline. Trade flourished under their control. The Silk Road, once dangerous and fragmented, became a single artery. Merchants traveled under the protection of the Khan's seal, a small tablet of wood or silver granting them the right to move safely. To harm a merchant under Mongol protection was to defy the empire itself. Such defiance was punished swiftly. Thieves were hanged, corrupt officials executed, bandits hunted across provinces. The empire might have been brutal, but it was consistent. The result was a world that began to move again. Caravans from the Mediterranean brought glass, silver, and cloth. From China came silk, porcelain, and tea. From India, spices, ivory, and jewels. The Mongols taxed everything, but lightly, understanding that trade thrived best when it was not afraid. And so, from the edge of Europe to the Yellow Sea, the same rules applied. For the first time in human history, one law touched half the known world. The Pax Mongolica also brought ideas. Monks, scholars, and travelers crossed lands that had once been enemies. A Franciscan friar named John of Plano Carpini reached Karakura in 1246, astonished to find a court where Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists debated before the same throne. A few years later, William of Rubruck, sent by the French king, described Mongol customs in detail, their food, their rituals, their curiosity. He found tolerance where he expected hostility. The Mongols had no desire to convert anyone. To them, every faith was simply another way of naming the eternal blue sky. Still, beneath that calm, the empire was restless. Expansion had slowed, but ambition had not. Mangek's brothers, Kublai and Hulagu, were already preparing new campaigns, one eastward, one westward. The world was vast, and the Mongols were not yet done exploring it, but for a brief moment, between wars, the empire was as close to peace as it would ever be. Imagine the roads then, the endless horizon dotted with riders, dust rising from hooves, the smell of sweat and leather carried on dry wind. At a relay station, a courier dismounts, hands his message to another, and drinks a bowl of fermented milk before vanishing again into the distance. In a distant city, a merchant reads an order written weeks ago and finds it already obeyed. Across the desert, a caravan of camels walks through silence, their bells ringing softly under a moon that once watched Genghis Khan himself. It was a piece of motion, not stillness, an empire of connection, not rest. The Mongols had conquered the world not by building walls, but by erasing them. Their rule was everywhere and nowhere, as invisible as the wind, as constant as the road. And yet, even wind changes. The empire was too large, too full, too alive to remain silent forever. The children of Genghis Khan would soon turn upon one another, dividing the sky their father had unified. But for now, the lamps of the relay stations still burned, the road still thronged with life, and the steppe, eternal, patient, and endless, watched quietly as its children ruled the earth. Kublai was born into a world already conquered. He grew up among maps, rather than horizons, learning the shape of an empire that stretched farther than any horse could ride. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the child of Tolui, and from his earliest years he understood the burden of inheritance, the weight of holding together what others had won. While his uncles and brothers ruled distant lands, Khabrari looked south. The riches of China shimmered beyond the rivers, waiting like a promise not yet kept. He was different from most of his kin. He loved the steppe but admired the cities. He studied Chinese philosophy, listened to Confucian scholars, and learned to govern as much with ink as with iron. He saw that conquest had built the empire, but knowledge would sustain it. Where his ancestors had burned libraries, he opened them. Where others tore down walls, he ordered them repaired. The Mongol Empire, under his hand, began to change its rhythm. It still moved, but with purpose instead of hunger. By the time Khabrari came to power, the war against the southern Song dynasty had dragged on 4 decades. The Song were rich, educated, and resourceful. Their armies used gunpowder, crossbows, and fortified cities that defied the open tactics of the steppe. To defeat them, Khabrari transformed the Mongol army into something new. He recruited Chinese engineers, Persian architects, and Muslim mathematicians. He built fleets of ships, learning to fight not only across plains, but on water. The nomads had become sailors. In 1259, during a campaign in the south, news arrived that the great Konmungi had died. The empire was once again leaderless. Khabrari returned north to claim the title, but his younger brother, Arik Bey challenged him. For the first time, the descendants of Genghis Khan fought one another openly. It was a civil war fought, not for new lands, but for meaning, whether the Mongols would remain riders of the steppe or rulers of cities. Khabrari won, though slowly. His brother surrendered, and the empire shifted on its axis. From that moment, the center of Mongol power began to move from the grasslands to the walled cities of China. In 1271, Khabrari declared a new dynasty, the Yuan. It was the first time a Mongol ruler took a Chinese imperial name. He made Beijing, then called Dadu, his capital. From there, he ruled not as a conqueror, but as an emperor. The transition was delicate. The Chinese had long seen the Mongols as outsiders, their rule as a temporary storm. Khabrari wanted permanence. He wore Chinese robes, built Confucian temples, and appointed scholars as officials. Yet he never forgot who he was. His court was still filled with horses, falcons, and the sound of steppe songs. The palace smelled of leather and milk as much as incense. The conquest of the Song continued. The final blow came in 1279, at the Battle of Yomen, where the last Song fleet was destroyed on the river. The emperor, a child of 8, drowned with his ministers rather than surrender. With that, the Mongols ruled all of China. From the frozen north to the humid south, the land was one empire. Khabrari had achieved what no dynasty before him could: unification under a single rule that stretched from the Pacific to the Himalayas. Yet governing China was different from ruling the steppe. The population was immense, the bureaucracy ancient, the culture older than memory. Khabrari adapted. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by appointed officials who answered directly to him. He standardized currency, introduced paper money, and built granaries to prevent famine. Roads and canals were repaired, connecting north and south. The Grand Canal, a lifeline of the empire, carried rice from the fertile Yangtze Valley to the hungry north. Trade thrived again, flowing like blood through newly opened veins. Foreigners came from every corner of the world. Persians brought glass and science, Arabs brought astronomy, and Europeans arrived out of curiosity. Among them was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who traveled across the Silk Road to Khabrari's court. He would later write that the emperor's wealth seemed endless: palaces of marble, feasts for thousands, roads lined with stations and guards. Yet beneath the splendor, Khabrari's empire was held together by discipline and paper, not gold. Every official's name was recorded, every tax noted, every order copied and sent by the Yam couriers who still galloped day and night across Asia. Khabrari's rule was not without strain. His wars in Southeast Asia and Japan failed. Typhoons, which the Japanese called divine winds, destroyed his invasion fleets. His armies suffered heavy losses in Vietnam and Burma. The empire's edges began to blur. The Mongols, who once thrived on open movement, found themselves slowed by mountains, jungles, and sea. Still, Kublai's court remained a marvel, a meeting place of every culture under the sun. Buddhist monks debated with Muslim scholars. Christian envoys from Rome dined beside Taoist priests. No single faith dominated. The empire was built on curiosity as much as conquest. But time is heavier than territory. The longer Kublai ruled, the more the old ways slipped away. His generals grew soft in comfort. His treasury strained under the cost of administration and war. The Great Yam network, once swift as wind, began to clog with bureaucracy. Taxes rose, rebellions stirred in the countryside. To the Chinese, he was both emperor and foreigner. To the Mongols, both ruler and exile. He belonged entirely to neither world. In his last years, he became quiet. The chronicles say he ate little, walked slowly, and often sat alone, listening to songs from the steppe. He missed the open horizon, the smell of grass, the way the wind used to move freely without walls. The empire he built was magnificent but heavy. The steppe had taught him that nothing stays still forever, and even empires obey that law. When Kublai died in 1294, he left behind a world transformed. China was unified, trade flowed across continents, and the Mongol Empire had reached the height of its cultural and political power. But his death also marked the beginning of decline. The sons of his brothers ruled distant lands, Persia, Russia, Central Asia, each claiming to be the true heir of Genghis Khan. The unity of the steppe had become a memory. Still, for a brief moment, under Kublai's reign, the earth itself seemed connected. From Venice to Beijing, from Baghdad to Korea, the Silk Road was alive. The seas were open, and letters written in one language were answered in another. The world had never been smaller, nor more awake. And when the emperor's body was carried north to rest beneath the eternal sky, the people of China and the steppe alike lit fires in mourning. For in him, the wind and the wall had briefly learned to speak the same language. The empire no longer thundered with war. Its rhythm had changed. The sound that once echoed across Asia, the crash of hooves, the clatter of armor, had softened into something quieter. The slow creak of carts, the footsteps of merchants, the clink of coins. The Mongol world was now a world of movement without battle. Roads had replaced conquest, letters replaced swords. It was still an empire of motion, but now its weapon was connection. From the ruins of burned cities, a new network had emerged, a web of trade and travel that bound together half the known earth. The Mongols had turned geography into infrastructure. Mountains were mapped, rivers measured, distances calculated. Where armies had once camped, post stations now stood, wooden shelters with hay, food, and guards. Every 30 kilometers, another waited, stocked with horses and fire. These were the heartbeats of the Yam, the imperial relay system. At night, lamps burned within them, more suns scattered across the continent. A message sent from Karakoram could reach Persia in weeks, not months. A decree issued in Dodu could be read in Samarkand before the ink was dry. The speed astonished even the Mongols themselves. They had mastered the art of moving through stillness. Riders galloped across deserts, forests, and frozen plains, stopping only long enough to switch horses and drink a bowl of warm milk. They carried scrolls sealed in leather, stamped with the Khan sign, a symbol that opened every door and silenced every question. The same routes that bore messages also bore trade. Merchants moved in caravans hundreds strong, guarded by the Khan soldiers. They carried silk, spices, and porcelain east to west, and brought silver, glass, and wool in return. The roads buzzed with languages: Turkic, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, Mongolian, even Latin. Along them rose caravanserais, roadside inns built of brick and stone, places where travelers could rest, pray, and bargain. Within their courtyards, one could see Persians haggling with Indians, Venetians writing letters by candlelight, and Mongol soldiers sharing fermented mare's milk with monks from Tibet. Under Mongol rule, safety was guaranteed by terror. The penalties for theft or violence were absolute. A caravan attacked once was avenged tenfold. Local rulers learned to protect trade routes, for a failure meant ruin. This ruthless efficiency brought stability. For the first time in centuries, a traveler could move from the edge of Europe to the Pacific without crossing a battlefield. Knowledge traveled alongside goods. Astronomers from Baghdad taught in Chinese observatories. Paper money, first minted under the Song dynasty, spread to Persia and beyond. Techniques of printing, gunpowder, and metallurgy followed the same routes. In return, art, philosophy, and faith moved eastward. Buddhism reached new lands. Islam spread deeper into Central Asia. Christianity sent envoys to courts that once seemed unreachable. The Mongols did not care which gods rode with the caravans, only that order did. In cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, the hum of trade never stopped. Scholars copied manuscripts, merchants counted coins, and the smell of spices clung to the air. Camels knelt at dusk, their bells jingling softly. Messengers arrived with dust in their hair and news in their hands. They spoke of distant floods, new wars, wars that ended before they began. The empire was not a single place, but a pulse that touched every direction at once. Even the seas joined the pattern. Under Kublai Khan, ports along the Chinese coast opened to merchants from Arabia, India, and Africa. Ships carried silk and porcelain west, returning with silver, ivory, and stories. The ocean became an extension of the steppe, vast, unpredictable, but navigable with discipline. At every harbor, officials stamped documents, weighed goods, and recorded the movement of the world. The empire had learned to count everything. Life along the Mongol roads followed a simple rhythm. At dawn, the stations came alive with sound. Horses snorted, wheels groaned, fires cracked. Couriers checked their seals, merchants packed their goods, cooks boiled tea that smelled faintly of smoke. Travelers shared stories before parting, stories of cities where rivers ran red during conquest, now calm and full of fishermen, of temples rebuilt with Mongol protection, of taxes paid in silk instead of blood. Then they rode out into the morning, the horizon empty and endless. For the ordinary people who lived under Mongol rule, peace was practical. Taxes were high, but predictable. Trade brought work. Banditry was rare. Villages rebuilt. Fields were sown again. The fear that had once followed the Mongols began to change shape. Not terror, but respect edged with caution. The empire was everywhere and nowhere, invisible yet felt. To the travelers from the west, it seemed impossible. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo reached the court of Kublai Khan, he marveled at the scale of the system. Roads wide enough for 10 horsemen, abreast bridges strong enough to carry entire caravans, granaries that fed armies without end. He saw post riders changing horses with clockwork precision, never pausing, never sleeping long. He wrote of cities larger than anything in Europe, of markets that glimmered with gold and silk, of a ruler who ruled by order rather than cruelty. His words would later sound like exaggeration, but they were not. The Mongol world had truly become the first global network, and yet, beneath the calm surface, the empire's strength depended on movement. When the road stopped, so would the peace. The system required endless coordination, endless discipline, endless obedience to the law of motion. It was a fragile kind of stability, a song that had to be sung without pause. At night, the steppe grew silent again. From a relay station somewhere near the Oxus River, a rider galloped into the dark, his torch flickering against the horizon. He carried no sword, only a scroll. Behind him, another horse waited, already saddled. Ahead of him stretched 10,000 miles of road, and beyond that, the sea. The stars above were the same ones that watched Genghis Khan ride into history a century before. They burned cold and steady, as if reminding the world that even in peace, the empire still belonged to the wind. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol world reached its calmest hour. The great storms of conquest had passed. The riders who once followed smoke and plunder now followed trade winds and schedules. The empire stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, a single network of cities, caravans, ships, and roads. The grasslands had given way to bureaucracy, the bow to the brush, the roar of battle to the murmur of counting houses. It was the height of the Pax Mongolica, when the world seemed briefly connected by invisible threads of order. In Karakoram, the old capital, life had grown steady. The wooden streets that once echoed with the tramp of soldiers now filled with artisans, traders, and officials. Horses grazed on the outskirts, while scribes bent over scrolls, recording taxes and trade in neat lines of Mongolian, Persian, and Chinese script. No city had ever contained so many languages. At the palace, foreign envoys arrived daily, Persians with maps, Arabs with astrolabes, Europeans with letters sealed in wax. The great Khan's court became a mirror of the world. To the west, in Persia, Hulagu Khan ruled the Khanate. His court in Tabriz glittered with scholars, poets, and scientists. He invited mathematicians from Baghdad, physicians from Damascus, and astronomers from Samarkand. Under his patronage, observatories were built, books were translated, and calendars recalculated. The Mongols who once saw stars only as guides for travel now studied them as measures of time. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty brought similar transformation. Roads, canals, and postal stations crisscrossed the land. The capital, Dodu, glowed at night with the lanterns of merchants and couriers. Paper money circulated, marked with official seals. Granaries fed the poor during famine years. The Mongols, once destroyers, had become administrators. The empire's strength lay not in its soldiers, but in its organization, in the accuracy of its census, the reliability of its couriers, the speed of its response. For merchants, these years were a golden age. The Silk Road thrived under protection. From Venice and Genoa, ships sailed east to the ports of the Levant, where caravans waited to carry their goods onward through Persia, Samarkand, and China. Spices, glass, furs, ivory, and silk flowed like rivers across continents. Caravanserais offered shelter every few days, their courtyards glowing with firelight, their walls echoing with a dozen tongues. A merchant could travel 4 years and never once fear robbery. Bandits were hunted with the same precision once reserved for enemy generals. It was not only goods that moved, knowledge crossed the roads too. Gunpowder recipes traveled from China to Europe. Paper and printing followed. From the Islamic world came medical texts, mathematics, and philosophy. From China came the compass, porcelain, and techniques of engineering. The Mongol Empire, indifferent to culture, but devoted to motion, became the great carrier of civilization. What it touched, it did not invent, but it connected. Even the arts changed. In the cities of Central Asia, Persian motifs met Chinese brushwork. Silk weavers blended patterns of dragons and arabesques. Metal workers engraved Mongol script beside Quranic verses. Art no longer belonged to one land. It belonged to all that the roads connected. Music spread too. Flutes from Persia, drums from China, the bowed instruments of the steppe merging into new forms. If one listened carefully in a market in Samarkand, one could hear a melody that began in Baghdad and ended in Beijing. Religion moved with equal freedom. The Mongols, pragmatic as always, allowed temples, mosques, churches, and shrines to stand side by side. In Karakoram, travelers wrote of Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, and Christian priests debating in the same hall, their voices mingling like streams into a single river. Kublai Khan himself favored Buddhism, but tolerated all. He believed that heaven was wide enough for every prayer. The empire was too large for one faith. Its god was order. In Europe, the Mongol peace felt like a distant miracle. Papal envoys traveled east, hoping to forge alliances. Traders returned from Cathay. the Mongol name for China, with stories of wealth and wonder. Maps grew more detailed, the edges of ignorance shrinking. Even languages began to borrow from one another. Words for money, silk, spice, and paper crossed borders as easily as caravans did. The world was becoming small enough to imagine. But under the surface, cracks had begun to form. The empire was no longer one will, one breath. Each branch of Genghis Khan's lineage ruled its own realm: the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia. They were united by name and law, but divided by ambition. The couriers still rode between them, but the tone of their letters grew colder. The steppe, which had once provided unity, was now only memory. Still, for a few decades, the machinery held, roads were repaired, taxes collected, ships launched from Chinese ports to trade with Java, India, and Africa. The empire touched every horizon. Even the weather seemed to obey it. Travelers wrote of crossing entire kingdoms without hearing the sound of war. The world had become organized, mapped, and astonishingly predictable. Imagine it. A merchant from Genoa rides east with a load of silver. He passes through cities that once burned under Mongol fire. Now he sleeps safely under their roofs. In Samarkand, he buys silk dyed with indigo. In Dunhuang, he eats rice from the south. In Dodu, he trades with Persians who speak Mongolian better than he does Italian. He returns home years later with gold and stories that no one believes. The Mongols have become both myth and fact, the destroyers who created safety. At night, the empire glowed faintly. Campfires, city lamps, ships' lanterns at sea. From space, if one could have looked down, the world would have appeared threaded with light. The steppe had finally become civilization. And yet, even in this stillness, the old wind remained. The couriers still galloped under the stars, carrying decrees and rumors. The system that had united half the world relied on speed, and speed could never last forever. By the dawn of the 14th century, the balance began to tilt. Plagues followed the trade routes. Famine spread in China. Rival khans quarreled. The same roads that carried silk and knowledge now carried death. The peace that had seemed eternal began to flicker, but that ending belongs to another story. For now, in this brief pause of history, the world rests under the empire of motion. The grass of the steppe waves softly in the wind. The lamps of Dodu burn steady. The roads of Samarkand hum with life. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, a rider changes horses in the dark, continuing the journey that began with a boy named Temujin, who once dreamed of a world that could move as one. The Mongol Empire had reached the height of its stillness. The roads were open, the seas alive, the capitals rich. But even the widest sky cannot hold one storm forever. What had begun as a single breath was slowly breaking into echoes. The descendants of Genghis Khan ruled from different horizons now. From Beijing to the Volga, from Persia to Samarkand, each called himself Khan. Each claimed to be the rightful heir of the eternal blue sky, and between them stretched silence, distance, and suspicion. It began quietly, as all endings do. Letters travelled slower. Messengers found fewer fresh horses at the relay stations. Governors delayed paying taxes, citing weather, illness, or war. Trade continued, but the tone of the empire changed. The great machine of motion, so carefully built, began to rust in places unseen. No one noticed at first. The roads still hummed, the markets still glittered. But unity, once invisible and certain, was fading like smoke on the wind. In Persia, the Ilkhanate flourished under Hulig's descendants. They built observatories, sponsored scholars, and raised new cities. But their wealth bred independence. The Ilkhans stopped sending tribute to the great Khan in China. Their letters still opened with words of loyalty, but the messengers no longer carried gold or orders. To the east, in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate followed its own rhythm, half steppe, half city. The sons of Chagatai ruled in the old nomadic way, mistrusting the luxury of the settled lands. They traded horses and silver, guarded their freedom, and watched their cousins with quiet hostility. Farther north, the Golden Horde stretched across the plains of Russia. Its capital at Sarai stood on the Volga, filled with merchants from every land. Here the Mongols had adapted to a colder world. They collected tribute from the Russian princes, letting them govern as long as the taxes flowed. The Horde grew powerful, rich, and suspicious of both Persia and China. Its khans preferred diplomacy to obedience, and their letters to Karakoram grew shorter each year. And then there was China, the Yuan dynasty of Kublai Khan. It was the largest and wealthiest of the Mongol realms, but also the heaviest. Administration consumed energy faster than war ever had. The Chinese population was vast, its officials numerous, its paperwork endless. Kublai's successors struggled to maintain control. They ruled from marble palaces, far from the steppe wind, surrounded by courtiers who spoke in whispers. The Mongol heart, once shaped by hunger and discipline, softened in comfort. Soldiers became bureaucrats, generals became governors. The empire of motion had slowed into one of ceremony. As decades passed, the connections between the khanates thinned. The couriers who once galloped across Asia now stopped at borders. Messages were opened, read, and sometimes never delivered. Each branch of the family began to write its own history, inventing its own destiny. Where once there had been one empire, there were now four, each remembering the same ancestor differently. The sons of Genghis Khan had become rivals in inheritance, and the eternal blue sky above them was no longer one horizon, but many. Trade endured longer than loyalty. Merchants cared little for politics. They still crossed the Silk Road, their camels heavy with silk and spices. The same caravan could pass through four empires and pay four sets of taxes, and still find profit. The Mongol peace continued, not because of unity, but because of habit. People had grown used to order. They followed its shape even when its source had gone. The roads were old enough to remember what men forgot. In the West, the Ilkhans turned to art and astronomy. They built schools, translated Greek texts into Arabic, and debated philosophy under painted ceilings. The Mongol khans, who had once destroyed Baghdad, now patronized scholars who mourned it. In the north, the Golden Horde blended into the world it ruled. Its khans adopted Islam. Its nobles married into Russian families. Its capital filled with mosques and markets. The steppe was learning the language of the city. In China, the Yuan dynasty tried to balance two worlds, Mongol power and Chinese tradition. But balance is never eternal. Corruption grew, famine returned, and whispers of rebellion spread like cracks in ice. By the early 1300s, the fractures were visible. The Shugotai Khanate split in two. The Ilkhans quarreled over succession. In Russia, the princes of Moscow began to rise, paying less tribute, learning the art of patience. In China, peasant uprisings erupted along the rivers. The Mongols still called themselves masters of the world, but the world was moving on without them. Even the weather seemed to shift. Winters grew longer, harvests weaker, caravans were stranded by storms. The yam stations, once beacons of light, began to fall into disrepair. Horses died, roads went untended. The empire that had once conquered distance was now conquered by it. Still, the memory of order lingered. Travelers like Ibn Battuta could journey across Asia and still find safety in Mongol lands. The empire's shadow remained generous even as its body faded. The laws of the khans, justice for merchants, protection for scholars, punishment for thieves, outlived their authority. It was the echo of an age when the earth had seemed small enough to ride across. Imagine those years, an empire vast, still breathing, but no longer one. In Samarkand, astronomers watched the stars through brass instruments. In Tabriz, poets wrote verses in Persian about khans they had never seen. In Dodu, the great city of China, clerks copied reports that would never reach their destination. And on the steppe, where it had all begun, the wind moved over empty camps, scattering the ashes of old fires. The Mongols had built a world that connected everything, but connection is fragile. The same roads that united kingdoms now carried silence between them. The same couriers who once brought orders now brought news of rebellions. The same sky that had blessed Genghis Khan watched his empire drift apart, piece by piece, like clouds dissolving after a storm. While the Mongol banners vanished from China, the western lands began their own slow fading. The empire had splintered long before Dodu fell. What remained of the great unity were its distant reflections, 4 khanates, each carrying the name of Genghis Khan, but none of his certainty. They ruled separate worlds now, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and a fragment of the Yuan that lingered in Mongolia itself. Together, they were like the last embers of a fire still warm but no longer bright. The Ilkhanate had once been the most cultured of them all. Its cities shimmered with scholars, poets, and observatories. Its rulers, descended from Hulagu, had rebuilt the lands their ancestors destroyed. They governed from Tabriz and Sultania, collecting taxes from Persia, Iraq, and Armenia. Under Genghis Khan, who converted to Islam in 1295, the Ilkhanate reached its height. He reformed coinage, reorganized administration, and built mosques beside libraries. The Mongols who had once erased Baghdad now prayed toward Mecca. Under his rule, the Persian Renaissance bloomed. Art, science, and architecture flourished like spring after storm. But the Ilkhanate's strength depended on stability, and stability is the rarest of luxuries. After Ghazan's death in 1304, succession disputes began. Each new Khan ruled for only a few years, undone by rivals, assassins, or illness. The bureaucracy that Ghazan had built became prey to corruption. Local governors stopped sending taxes. The Mongol army, once the terror of Asia, turned into mercenaries for hire. By the 1330s, famine struck Persia. The Black Death followed, cities emptied, roads fell silent. The Ilkhanate died not with rebellion, but with neglect. Its last ruler, Abu Sa'id, left no heir. When he died in 1335, his generals carved the realm into fragments. The Ilkhan's throne stood empty, and the eternal blue sky above Persia went dark. To the north, the Chagatai Khanate endured longer, though it too began to bend. It was the most divided of all the Mongol realms, half nomadic, half urban, half Turkic, half Mongol. Its khans ruled from the oasis cities of Transoxiana, but spent their summers on the plains. For a century it had balanced between steppe and city, until the balance broke. In the 14th century, the Khanate split in two. The western part turned Muslim and Persianate. The eastern part, called Mogulistan, remained nomadic and Buddhist. They shared a name, but not a soul. Faction fought faction. Some years saw 3 khans crowned, none surviving long enough to rule. The roads of Samarkand and Kashgar still thrummed with trade, but behind the wealth lay exhaustion. The Mongol order had grown old. Out of that decay, new men rose. In the late 1300s, one of them, a soldier from Samarkand named Timur, or Tamerlane, began to gather power. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan by marriage, not blood, but carried the same ambition. He rebuilt the art of conquest with Persian polish and Mongol speed. Under his command, the remnants of the Chagatai lands became a new empire, brutal and brief. Timur saw himself as heir to Genghis, but he built palaces instead of postal stations, monuments instead of systems. His armies moved like the old Mongol hosts, but left behind marble instead of order. When he died in 1405, his empire collapsed as quickly as it had risen, another echo fading into silence. Farther north, the Golden Horde held on the longest. From the 13th to the 15th century, its khans ruled the vast grasslands of Russia and Ukraine, their power stretching from the Black Sea to the Urals. They collected tribute from the Russian princes, letting them govern their own people in exchange for loyalty. The Horde's capital, Sarai, grew into one of the largest cities in Eurasia, a city of markets, masks, and tents, where coins from Venice and China changed hands under the same roof. For generations, its khans kept peace along the trade routes. Caravans crossed the Volga, merchants traveled under the Horde's protection, and silver flowed through its markets. But wealth bred rivalry. After the death of Aziz Beg Khan in 1341, the Horde began to fracture. Civil wars erupted between rival claimants. As in Persia, famine and plague weakened what politics could not. The Black Death swept through the steppe, killing horses and herders alike. Tribute from the Russian cities dwindled. Moscow, once obedient, began to resist. Its princes learned the Mongols' lessons too well: patience, unity, calculation. In 1380, the Russian prince Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army at the Battle of Kulikovo. It was not the end of the Horde, but it was the first crack in its armor. A century later, under Ivan III, the Russians would refuse tribute altogether. The Horde, unable to gather itself, dissolved into smaller khanates: Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan. The empire that had once burned Kiev now bowed to its descendants. The fall of the Western khanates was not a single collapse, but a long unraveling. Each thread of the great web frayed separately. The Ilkhanate died of succession, the Chagatai of division, the Golden Horde of distance and time. Only the memory of their systems survived: the tax codes, the relay posts, the tolerance for traders and travelers. The structure remained even after the rulers vanished. The Mongols had changed the world so completely that even their absence carried their shape. By the late 15th century, the age of khans had passed. New powers rose from their ruins: the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, the Safavids in Persia, the Mughals in India, the Muscovites in Russia. All borrowed something from the Mongols: their strategies, their administration, their vision of empire. The wind that once carried Mongol banners now filled the sails of others. Imagine the steppe at that time: wide, silent, nearly empty again. The old roads still traced their lines through the grass. Stone ruins of caravanserais still stood beside dry wells. At night, shepherds found pieces of arrowheads buried in the dirt, remnants of an age when the world belonged to riders. The eternal blue sky remained unchanged, vast and indifferent. It had watched empires rise and fall before. Now it watched the last Mongol banners fade into memory. In Persia, poets wrote elegies for vanished khans. In Russia, monks recorded the names of Mongol overlords in cautious handwriting. In Samarkand, travelers told stories of a time when a single order could cross half the world without question. And in Mongolia, the wind still blew through the valleys where Temujin had been born, carrying nothing but grass seeds and silence. The empire was gone, but its roads remained. The same paths that once carried armies now carried history itself. The Mongols had united the continents, and in their absence, the world stayed connected. That was their final conquest, to make movement permanent. The horsemen had vanished, but the world still moved in their wake. When the empire was gone, the steppe remained. The grass returned to cover the scars of war, and the wind resumed its old work, erasing. The roads that once throbbed with hooves and wheels now lay silent under drifting sand. The world the Mongols had built did not end suddenly. It faded, slowly, like a campfire dying at dawn. The khans were gone, the banners folded, the horses scattered, but their echo lingered, not in power, but in memory. The Mongols who stayed on the steppe returned to the rhythm that had birthed them. They heard it again, sang to their flocks, and watched the seasons pass. In the valleys of the Kurlan and Onon rivers, the same winds that once carried orders to conquer now rustled through the grass with no one to hear them. Nomadic life endured, smaller, poorer, but freer. The empire had come and gone like a storm, leaving the steppe both unchanged and haunted. Yet beyond the plains, traces of that empire survived in the bones of civilization itself. The Mongols had redrawn the world's map, and the lines they left behind remained long after their names vanished. The postal stations they built became towns. The caravan routes became nations' lifelines. The The Silk Road, once guarded by their riders, stayed open, now watched over by the merchants and kings who inherited their order. Even the language of empire lingered, words for tax, trade, and paper passed into Persian, Russian, and Turkish speech. Mongol loanwords crept silently into the dialects of Asia and Eastern Europe, small reminders of a world once ruled from horseback. Administrative systems across continents still bore their mark: censuses, travel passes, relay networks, diplomatic immunity, all born from the logic of Mongol efficiency. The empire had fallen, but the idea of global governance had begun. In Persia and Central Asia, chroniclers wrote of the Khans with mixed awe and regret. They described them as both saviors and destroyers, men who brought civilization through fire. Poets turned their histories into allegories of kings who conquered the world only to lose themselves in its vastness. Artists painted miniatures of Mongol courts, their faces half Persian, half Turkic, their robes blending steppe and silk. Time softened the terror. What had been fear became fascination. In Russia, memory took a darker shape. For 2 centuries, the Golden Horde had ruled the Russian lands, collecting tribute and dictating allegiance. When Moscow rose to power and overthrew that rule, it inherited much of what it hated: centralized authority, a taste for empire, and a belief in destiny. The Mongols vanished, but their shadow followed every Russian ruler who dreamed of expansion. Their discipline, their postal routes, their vision of endless land, all became part of Russia's own story. In China, the Ming dynasty erased the Yuan with deliberate care. Mongol names were struck from monuments, their palaces demolished, their officials executed. The steppe was pushed back to the north, a border to be feared again. Yet the Ming emperors adopted parts of their system too: the courier networks, the census, the land registers. They rebuilt the Great Wall, not merely to keep the Mongols out, but to contain their memory. The empire that had ruled from Beijing had been Mongol first, and China would never entirely forget it. Elsewhere, the echoes took gentler forms. Along the trade routes that survived into the 15th and 16th centuries, travelers still found relics of Mongol order: relay posts standing half buried in sand, their timbers grey with age. Iron rings once used to tether horses, broken clay seals stamped with the imperial tanga. Caravan leaders told stories of the time when the world was one road. Pilgrims from the west spoke of reaching cities that had once been Mongol capitals: Samarkand, Bukhara, Tabriz, and finding libraries where Mongol scribes had copied books in 3 languages. Legends spread across cultures. In Persia, Genghis Khan became a figure of divine punishment, sent by heaven to cleanse corruption. In Europe, he was the Phantom of the East, the horseman of revelation. In Mongolia, he became something else entirely, not a conqueror, but a forefather. The chronicles written centuries later, like the secret history of the Mongols, turned him into a mythic ancestor, fierce, wise, chosen by the sky. Even in ruin, he remained the center of the story. In the 16th century, small Mongol khanates still wandered the steppe, the remnants of the great lineages. They traded furs and horses, sometimes raided, sometimes allied with their new neighbors, the Russians, the Chinese, the rising Manchus. They were ghosts of an empire that refused to rest. Their rulers still called themselves sons of heaven, though no one beyond the plains remembered their titles. They rode the same horses, sang the same songs, and told their children of the days when their ancestors had ruled the world. Travelers from Europe who crossed Mongolia in later centuries wrote of the silence. They found the land immense and unmarked, its people humble but proud. They could not believe that this quiet world had once commanded armies that reached Hungary, Persia, and Korea. Yet when they listened to the songs of the herders, they heard the names of the old Khans woven into the verses, carried softly on the wind. The empire had died, but it still breathed through memory. The Mongols did not vanish from history. They changed shape, from conquerors to ancestors, from empire to influence. Their story became a mirror in which every later empire saw itself. The Ottomans, the Russians, the British, each borrowed the same dream of connection, the same hunger for control, the same illusion of permanence. The Mongols had proved that the world could be won, and that no one could hold it for long. Imagine, now, the steppe under moonlight. The grass moves in long waves, the air smells of earth and frost. Far away, a campfire flickers beside a river, and a herder hums to his horses. The sound is small, but it carries far, across the same land that once shook with 10,000 hooves. The stars above are the same that guided Genghis Khan across Asia. Nothing has changed, and everything has. The empire is gone, the riders sleep, but the world they made, of roads, of exchange, of shared silence between civilizations, remains. Their story has no monument, no final tomb. Only the horizon, endless and patient, watching as history moves across it like wind. And in that wind, if you listen long enough, you can still hear the faint, steady rhythm of hooves, fading, but never gone. The story of Genghis Khan begins with a boy in the grass and ends with the world remade. It stretches from the cold dawn of the Mongolian plains to the marble courts of China, from the banks of the Volga to the walls of Baghdad. For more than a century, the earth moved to the rhythm of hooves. Empires rose and fell in the space between one order and the next. When the dust finally settled, nothing remained unchanged. Not the roads, not the languages, not even the sky above the known world. Genghis Khan never built a monument to himself. He left no tomb of gold, no pyramid of stone. His grave was the land itself, the open steppe, endless and nameless. Yet his presence lingers in ways more durable than marble. The systems he imagined, the order he imposed, the discipline he demanded, all survived his body. He was not a man of architecture or art, but of movement. His empire was not a place but a pulse. In his lifetime, he united tribes that had spent centuries at war. He forged laws where none had existed, crafted a language of command that crossed tongues, and turned motion into administration. His successors expanded upon his design, turning a world of scattered peoples into a network of roads, markets, and messages. From that network came a new idea, that the world could be one system, connected by trade, trust, and the threat of speed. The Mongols did not invent civilization, they accelerated it. They carried inventions farther than their creators dreamed possible. Paper money, gunpowder, compasses, printing. They carried religions and philosophies too, without prejudice or favor. In their world, a Christian monk, a Muslim scholar, and a Buddhist monk could travel the same road, stop at the same inn, and leave safely for different horizons. No empire before had created such possibility. And yet, theirs was not a gentle rule. Cities burned, libraries vanished. Populations were erased in the name of obedience. The Mongols taught the world both the efficiency of order and the cost of enforcing it. They destroyed more than they could ever measure, and built a peace that could only exist through fear. Their empire was magnificent, but not merciful. After it ended, the roads stayed, the bridges remained. The vision of a single connected world outlived its founders. The Mongols showed what could be done when motion replaced boundaries, when the earth was not divided by mountains or rivers, but linked by them. Every later empire would borrow from their model. The Ottomans, the mules, the Russians all carried fragments of the Mongol design. Even modern systems of trade and communication trace their ancestry to those same relay stations across the steppe. What remains of them now is silence and memory. The names of their khans echo through languages like distant thunder: Genghis, Gedai, Mengi, Kublai. To some, they are tyrants, to others, visionaries. To historians, they are evidence of what ambition can create and what it inevitably consumes. To the Mongols themselves, they are ancestors, resting beneath the eternal blue sky, still part of the wind. If you stand today on the plains of Mongolia, you can feel that wind. It carries the scent of grass and ash, the breath of centuries. The horizon is so wide that it swallows time. You could imagine, just for a moment, that you hear hooves, not near, not loud, but steady, far away. Perhaps it is the memory of the empire passing through again, a whisper of the old rhythm that once bound half the earth together. In the end, Genghis Khan's legacy is not conquest, it is connection. He turned the world into a map of paths and possibilities. He proved that distance could be overcome, that order could be made from chaos, if only for a while. His empire was brief, but its shadow fell long across history. We live still in that shadow, moving along the same lines he drew. Our roads, our borders, our ambitions all faintly shaped by his. And when the night comes over the steppe, the stars return, the same stars that watched him ride, the same constellations that guided his armies home. They shine cold and constant over an empty land, their light falling on grass that hides forgotten camps and the bones of forgotten riders. The empire sleeps, but the sky remembers. So now, as the story closes, let the wind be the final voice. Let the world settle back into quiet. The hooves fade, the dust falls, the fire dies low. Somewhere in the dark, the last messenger changes horses, mounts, and rides into the horizon that never ends. His lamp grows smaller, then disappears. Only the sound of the wind remains, steady, endless, patient, carrying forward the whisper of a name that once ruled the world.